stories like that connected with all of these exhibits. The Eva Leonard story is well illustrated here. The coal mine, everybody remembers the coal mine, and actually the exhibit that's here, partially down at our building at the fairgrounds, about tiling and the history of farm tiling or ag tiling, ground tiling in Greene County to reduce the wetlands way back. But I think decades from now, an exhibit that will bring people here from all over is the Abraham Lincoln exhibit that was donated to us in 2016 by Jed Magee, who's presenting the program today. That was an amazing gift to this historical society. 10 shelves of books that were in his law office up in Charles City at the time. Dozens of busts of Lincoln. How many were there? Were there 40, 30 busts of Lincoln? Hundreds of photographs, most of which you've never seen before, 2 of them over 100 years old. We've got all of that in here, and it's all basically kind of spread around the east end of the museum, and then now partially covered by our exhibits on the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So, but as time goes on, people are going to flock here to tap into all of that Lincoln memorabilia, and especially the books. Jed said one reason he gave it to us here was because of the access on the historic Lincoln Highway, but also a place where we could properly display the books so people can get used to the idea they can come in here and borrow them and use them, because he's very interested in that happening. Jed is a native of Dunkerton, Iowa, who has lived with us in Greene County in 2 hitches. He went to, after Dunkerton High School, he went to the University of Iowa for his undergraduate studies and his law degree, and in 1967 came to Jefferson as a young lawyer hired by Francis Cudahy, and was here for 25 years until 1992. During that 25 years here, you couldn't be much more active in the community than Jed Magee was. Everything from one of the founders of the Greene County Community Players, an actor, a director. What office did you hold?
I was the state president for Iowa Community Theater. So.
State president for Iowa Community Theater, but were you also were you a JP or city attorney? You were city attorney for Jefferson, and his wife Betty had to get the gift shop Betty's Gifts, which wound up being, she sold to the Feldmans, and today it's the Printer's Box. They were very active in the community, and then in '92, Jed was appointed to the district court bench and assigned to the district up east of Mason City, in the Charles City area, and was a juvenile court judge up there. Most of his 17 years, roughly, and then was in senior status and served up there in all kinds of cases. And then as he was getting ready to retire, fully retire in 2015, he realized he had to do something about his Lincoln collection, which was occupied, was it your judge's chambers in Charles City? And so he thought about what he was going to do with that, and remembered Jefferson and Greene County, and got in touch with Roger Eggeter, our executive director.
Okay, so I'm his sidekick today. So I get this call.
And Cease Bruno, the president then.
So I get this call from Jed, and I knew Betty and knew Jed, but they get this call saying, I have this collection that I've collected since I was in, you said this right, in junior high. And I thought, well, this could be okay. And he says, I'd like to give it to Greene County. And I don't know if I said yes immediately, or if I said, let me come up and look at it, like I do with some of you guys. Let me look at it first before I say it. But anyway, the story that I remember is I take a van or my truck, I can't remember which, and they said, well, it's a little bit more than a truck full. Yeah! I go up there one day, and I walk into his office, which was probably 30 by 30, I'm just kind of guessing, 40 by 40, pretty big office, and I'm walking up. Holy cats, there's Lincoln stuff on every wall, and he's got most of it packed up already because he's already kind of retired and moving on to another office or something. And I thought, there's no way we're going to get this into my truck, and get it back, but we did. I think we had 3 vans came back that day. and then loaded it. What a gift.
41 boxes of books I saw here in this.
What a gift. What a gift and donation to us. It's a tremendous gift. I thank you again.
But if you give us something, we're not done with you. Because we've milked him for about 3 or 4 programs on Abraham Lincoln since he's moved back here. And obviously, the community's appetite for learning more about Abraham Lincoln approaches what Jed's must be, because with this tremendous crowd here today. So the focus today, as you probably saw, is Lincoln's learning and his mentors. So welcome again, Jed Magee.
Thanks, Chuck. Can you hear me back there? I'll try my best. As I said a couple of weeks ago, today's pretty intimidating following the program we had about 2 or 3 weeks ago. Chuck Holden, historian, I said, I hate to be the guy to follow him, because for a historian, he was very humorous. I won't promise anything like that today. The second thing is, whenever I'm asked to do this and I start a Lincoln program and talk about Lincoln, I say, why do people want to know that stuff? You know, aren't they going to get tired of hearing about Lincoln? So I have to come up with something new every time. And this particular subject is one I've thought about for a long time. How did this guy end up where he did? When you think about where he began. I still have some of the books. They're not all back here. I still have some at home, as you can see the display here and here. 2 of them, or 3 of them that I used for this speech in particular, I want to just mention. And people, not just here, but other places, are so interested in Lincoln. I got this book in the mail about 6 months ago from a friend of mine, actually a writing group up in Osage, Iowa. I'd helped out a gal, and she sent me this book, printed in 2021. There's about 11 books every year printed about and published about Lincoln. So that's one. And this, interestingly, when I was starting this speech, I got this book, and it's called Lincoln's Mentors. So what a great timing that was. The other one is this. Another one is this book called Founder's Son. Also a fairly recent book, I think 2018 or 19, by Richard Brookhiser, and it's called Founder's Son. And at the time, I didn't quite know what that meant or what he was getting at, but I finally figured it out, and I'll talk about it a little later in my speech. He revered the founders of our country so much that this gave rise to this book. Basically, he was the heir to George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, James Madison, James Monroe, because that's who he studied. So we'll talk about that a little bit. fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. You've all heard that many times. Probably a lot of us have memorized it. How did a guy that was born uneducated, born of an illiterate mother, an illegitimate mother, matter of fact, and a basically illiterate father, a hard laborer, a frontier lawyer, how did he come to write one of the most famous speeches in our country's history? And other speeches, just as notable, but maybe not as widely quoted. And how did this same person, who grew up in the wilderness, guide our country through its greatest crisis? This guy had no executive experience. He did serve 1 term in Congress. But back then, the policy was you serve your term and then you let somebody else serve. Wouldn't that be nice if we did that? But how did he do that? Again, going back to his roots. He was born in Hodgenville, Kentucky, a place called the Sinking Springs Farm. 1-room shack, dirt floor. Thomas Jefferson was president then. The Constitution was only 20 years old at that time. Signers of the Declaration of Independence were still alive at that time. At age 9, they moved from that place 100 miles away to Indiana. And he soon lost his mother. In 1818, he was 9 years old. His mother died from milk sickness or sleeping sickness. And interestingly, his father went to find a new mother or a new bride, however you want to put it. He went back to Kentucky, left Abraham Lincoln and his little older sister and cousin Dennis Hanks in a cabin out in the wilderness in Indiana. In the beginning, it was what they call a half town shack, because it was only had 3 walls, and the 4th wall was skins or blankets or some sort of covering. He left those kids for 2 months while he went back to Kentucky to get his second wife. They subsisted in that wilderness, God knows how, because all that was there were Indians and bears and wolves and wildcats. And when Thomas came back in December of 1819, December, think about it, wintertime, Sarah Bush Johnson was his new wife. She was a widow from Kentucky, paid her debts, brought her in a covered wagon and 3 kids back to Indiana. She found these kids that were no better than wild animals. 3 of them lived in this basically shack. Only once did Abraham Lincoln ever allude to his heritage. Once when he was a lawyer, he was riding with his partner William Herndon on circuit. And he brought it up out of the blue. Herndon related this story and talked about how unusual it was for him to talk about it. He said, you know, my mother, her father was not the man her mother married. She was illegitimate. Father of Nancy Hanks was a well-bred Virginian, a broad-minded, unknown Virginian. I think I've derived my brains and ambition and better nature and finer qualities from him. Fact or fantasy, nobody knows if it's true. Billy Herndon was known to tell stories, but a lot of people believe that this one was fairly accurate, that Lincoln said that. The point is, at this point, when Thomas Lincoln returned with Sarah Bush Johnson, the new Mrs. Thomas Lincoln was the first major factor in Lincoln's education. He had none at that point, basically. Besides furniture and 3 kids, she brought books, a Bible, Aesop's Fables, a reader book with many classic moral axioms in it by Lindley Murray, History of the United States by William Stotts, Lessons in Elocution by John Bunyan, Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. Pilgrim's Progress at that time was probably the best-selling book in the country except for the Bible. Almost every family had a copy of the Pilgrim's Progress. He later also got a copy of Pastor Ween's Life of Washington, which most families had and read at that time. There's a story about that book. He got that later in life, and he was in the loft in their cabin, and he laid it up on a shelf or between the logs, and it got wet, the log cabin, so it ruined it. And he went to the man he borrowed it from, told him about it, got to keep the book, but it was his pay and penalty was pulling corn stalks for 2 days for corn fodder for the cattle. That's how he paid for that book. Sarah Bush Johnson, now Lincoln, encouraged him, despite her husband's arguments, because it was hard labor, clearing prairie, clearing forest, clearing the wilderness. But Sarah encouraged him, despite Thomas's arguments. Lincoln was often under a tree reading a book, constantly with a book, and Thomas, good-natured in a way, just let him be and went ahead and did his own chores. Didn't bother him, according to Sarah. So he became, at that point, a lifelong learner. He's a great example for young people even today. Later in life, Lincoln said, and when he was in the White House, "All that I am, I owe to my dear mother," referring to Sarah Bush Johnson, Lincoln, not Nancy Hanks. And Sarah said, "His mind and mine seemed to run together." So she was a great encouragement. Back then, if they had any schools, Indiana in particular was really wilderness, and they didn't move to Illinois for about 20-some years. But if they had schools, they were subscription schools. In other words, it wasn't quite tuition, but people got together to pay subscriptions to start a school or hire somebody to come teach, usually itinerant preachers or teachers. And often there were blab schools. Lincoln often talked about blab schools, where the method of learning was either just repeat what the teacher said, or the teacher would give you a book and try to get you to read, often the Bible and scriptures. And again, those schools were often taught by roving teachers and roving preachers. And then a lot of them were almost illiterate themselves. One of the things Lincoln learned from those, though, was how to mimic the preachers in particular. After a sermon out in the woods somewhere, or in a small church somewhere, he would entertain his fellow kids by giving the sermon over again with a humorous twist. And he'd do it on a stump or he'd do it on a rail fence, and that's how he entertained his friends and how he learned to speak and how he learned a lot of the things that he learned at that point. He said himself, when people ask him about his education and schooling, he said he went to school by littles, as he put it. And his whole education amounted to less than a year, as he put it, which is correct. When he was in Congress, they did a biography of him and asked him for a short biography for some purpose. And when they asked about his education, he answered it with one word: deficient. And at this time, he's 30-some years old, and that's how he defines his education. I want to read you something from The Wit and Wisdom of Abraham Lincoln by Anthony Gross. And this was a story from the White House. He was meeting with Senator Henderson in the White House. He was in the middle of the war, and he was being harassed by what they call the radicals in Congress. If you know what the radicals were, they were people that just demanded and insisted on abolition, and punish the South. They really made his life difficult. There were three of them. There were Sumner, Stevens, and Wilson, were three of those people from Congress. One day he was standing in his office talking to this Senator Henderson, and he saw them coming down the sidewalk or down the street towards the White House. And out of the blue, he gave this story. The only school I ever had, Henderson, was a log schoolhouse when reading books and grammars were unknown. All our reading was done from the scriptures. And we stood in a long line and read in turn from the Bible. One day we were reading about the Israelites who were thrown into the fiery furnace. It fell to one little fellow to read that verse where that occurred. For the first time in that chapter. And up came the names Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The little boy went all to pieces on Abednego, stumbled on Shadrach, floundered on Meshach. Instantly the master of the school hit him on the side of the head, and he left him wailing and blubbering, passing the Bible to the next in line. Finally, they got through the whole line and came back to the young man, same passage, second time. All of a sudden he started to wail. Even alarmed the master, who said, and with unusual gentleness, "What's the matter now?" "Well, master, here comes them same damn three fellers." But like a lot of Lincoln's stories, it had a point. When he finished it, he pointed out the window and said, there they are. The three radicals coming to make his life miserable. But again, that's a point of how he told stories to make a point. And always a lot of wisdom. There's little known about his education and learning from the time they were in Indiana and then he moved to Illinois. He was about 18 years, except hard work, incessant incessant hard work, but he continued to be an incessant reader. Many people thought he was lazy, and his mother, Sarah Boyce Johnson, talked about that because they always saw him under a tree or next to a fence or a rock or someplace reading a book. So they thought he was lazy, but he was really stimulating his mind. He often said that his father taught him hard work, taught him how to work, but he did not teach him how to love it. Part of that reason for that statement is that in that day and age, when you worked, your father got all your income when you were age 21. That was always a sore subject of thinking. And when he left home at age 21, he left when he could, and be on his own, it left him estranged from his father the whole rest of his life. And one time later on, when his father was quite ill and near death, his stepbrother wanted to come visit, and he commented that it wouldn't do either one of us any good. So he never did go. Father died, he didn't go to the funeral, and never did arrange for a tombstone or a gravestone for his father. Although he did go visit his stepmother before he went to Washington when he was elected. Anyway, that was like the first stage in his learning and education. The second stage came basically when he showed up in New Salem, Illinois. He wandered in, basically penniless. Himself, he said, "I arrived like a piece of floating driftwood." And that's very true. No money, no skills, no job, no possessions. He didn't get a job at a store, Offutt store, became a clerk there. He also took a flatboat to New Orleans on 2 occasions on a contract with a fellow who owned the mill. That gave him some education. That was his first exposure to slavery, was to see the slave markets in New Orleans when he took that flatboat trip. Eventually, while at the store, he had access to books and newspapers and travelers, people coming through. Later, after the store, as he put it, winked out, he had a small foray into owning the store himself, left him with a large debt. But he then got a job as an assistant at the post office. That was the next greatest thing for his education, because the post office had newspapers, letters that people asked him to read. They had more books that came through the postal. There was poetry, mathematics, law books. He found a set of law books in a barrel left by some pioneers moving west. That was the Indiana statutes. He read those from cover to cover. He also at that time started reading Shakespeare and the poet Robert Burns. One of these authors in one of these books made the comment that when he read deeply, and poetry was a mirror for his moods. And he read vociferously history, politics, issues of the day. When he was at the post office, especially one of the things that helped his education was he read the Louisville Journal. It came daily. It was the most popular paper in Illinois and in that area. It was a Whig paper. The Whigs were the predecessor to the Republican Party, Whigs and Democrats. And papers at that time were openly and quite actively in favor of a certain party, one or the other, Whigs or Democrats. So this was a Whig paper. He read that daily, read it to people, read it out loud. It contained history, speeches, politics, talked about issues. At one point during this period, he also memorized the Declaration of Independence. Imagine that. Not a real long document, but still quite a few words. Quite a bit longer than the Gettysburg Address. But he memorized it. He studied that, and he studied and revered the Constitution. Again, that's why Louis Brookhiser wrote this book, Founder's Son. He studied the Constitution and the Founders. And as Brookhiser said in this book, he talked about Founder's Son, and again, Lincoln as the heir to the people like Madison, Monroe, Adams, Jefferson, Washington. He was the true heir of the Founders and their principles. They became his historical mentors, which I had never thought about before, and that really pointed out to me in these books I've read this summer. that they really did become his mentors. And it's evident through his speeches, the comments that he made, and how he acted as president. One of his first real mentors, live person, in fact, was somebody in New Salem, Mentor Graham. It's interesting, his first name was Mentor. And Mentor Graham was a school teacher in New Salem. And he took an interest in Abraham Lincoln and encouraged him to study math, geometry, and of all things, said, if you want to get ahead in the world, and especially if you want to be in politics and be in the legislature, study grammar, especially grammar. That led Lincoln to many things, including studying grammar. Also, he taught himself, through the geometry books and mathematics books, he taught himself surveying. And then got a job as an assistant surveyor in New Salem, so he could work and earn a living. But that's an example of how he was self-taught. Mentor Graham loaned him books for that purpose and other purposes. It's interesting about his surveying career. It wasn't real successful, but kept his body and soul together. But the store that he had helped buy and operate for a while, that, as he put it, winked out, left him with a debt of about $1,200, a huge sum in the 1830s. So he got sued, and the sheriff seized all of his property, including his horse, all the tax for the horse, and all his surveying equipment. And they had a sheriff's sale and sold all his equipment. Fortunately for him, because of his ability to get along with people and identify with people, one of his friends bought all that equipment and gave it back to him. Otherwise, he might have almost starved to death. In fact, Mentor Graham, the person that was his first mentor, made this quote. He said his textbook, Lincoln's textbook, was the Louisville Journal. Also in New Salem, he met two other mentors that were important in his life, and his life almost to the end of his life, to his death. One was the local JP, happened to be a Democrat. He knew Lincoln was a Whig, but he encouraged him. I encouraged him to run for the legislature and encouraged him to start studying law. Also at that same time was his friend John Todd Stewart, who also offered him the chance to read law books at his office in Springfield. Both Bowling Green and John Todd Stewart were with Lincoln in the Black Hawk War. Very brief, made one excursion across the river into Iowa, never did see an Indian, never fired a shot. Someone asked Lincoln once about his military career. He said, well, I bent a musket real badly once. But he met those two people who became long friends, lifelong advisors, lifelong mentors. And he himself said about that and about Bowling Green, I owed more to Mr. Green for his advancement than to any other man. So he recognized early on the help he got from people. It shows also the value of having a teacher, a friend, and a mentor, how important it can be in your future. I hope young people will learn that and understand that today. Here's a quote from Walking with Lincoln, which is one of those books that I use getting prepared. And this is a quote, and this is actually a quote from another book, which is a 1908 biography of Lincoln. It said this about him, his history and his abilities in New Salem. He was a judge, arbitrator, umpire, authority in all disputes, games, and matches, a pacificator, not pacifier, but pacificator, whatever that is, in all quarrels, everybody's friend, the best natured, the most sensible, the best informed, the most modest and unassuming, the kindest, gentlest, roughest, strongest, best fellow in all New Salem and the region. That's quite a statement. And that's why he eventually became successful, because that was his reputation and that was his status in this locale of New Salem, which is 8 or 12 or 16 miles north of Springfield. mentions his strength. He's one of the strongest. There's a story about that, how he became friends and made friends in New Salem. There's a group called the Clary Grove Boys who sort of terrorized the neighborhood. And, it was a, sort of a local gang. They weren't criminals, but they were kind of toughs. And one of them, Jack Armstrong, was a leader, and he challenged Lincoln to a wrestling match in New Salem. And they wrestled it, and it really quite a no-holds-barred frontier kind of wrestling. They came to a draw. And Jack Armstrong shook his hand, and they became fast friends for the rest of their lives because of that. In fact, Lincoln ended up as a lawyer representing this guy's brother in a murder trial, and was able to get him acquitted in a murder trial. Famous story, another famous case called the Moonlight Trial, because he used an almanac to show that there was no moonlight, and the witnesses couldn't see what they claimed they were seeing. Another quote from Mentors, the book that I got this summer, as John Todd Stewart said. And John Todd Stewart became a legislator, congressman, probably one of the most influential or famous lawyers in Illinois. And this is what he said about Lincoln later in life. Lincoln refused to be sold. He never had a price, which also is an incredible statement of his ethics and his honor and his honesty. The next step that he had was trying to win a seat in the legislature, encouraged by Mentor Graham, by Bowling Green, and by John Todd Stewart. He ran in 1832 and lost. And one of his speeches, he gave at a country church. He said, I'm Abraham Lincoln, I'm running for legislature, but if the voters see to keep me in the background, I've had too many disappointments in life to be much chagrined about losing again. And he did. But 2 years later, in 1834, he won and started his career in the Illinois legislature, which really took off for him politically after that point. As he put it, and again, another example of his learning and his education, got to go to the state legislature, was in Vandalia at that time. He spent a lot of time nosing around the state law library. It was full of books, imagine that. So he was in hog heaven and spent lots of time in the state law library. Mostly what he did was research Lincoln, or research Washington, and more about the founders of our country. That library had a copy of James Madison's papers and his notes, and he perused those and studied those. What a find for somebody who's desperate and anxious for knowledge. As one of the authors has said, Lincoln's ambition was to fit himself properly for what he considered some important predestined work. It's quite a statement to thinking about what the future might hold for him. And it was part of that was from Orville Browning, another mentor that became a lawyer in Illinois, who also urged him to become a lawyer. During his period in the Illinois legislature, there's lots of stories about them, including once jumping out a two-story window with the other colleagues to prevent a vote. Sort of like the guys in Texas that led Texas so they couldn't have a quorum. Lincoln and what they call the Long Nine, because if you added all their heights together, it was 81 feet. But they jumped out the second-story window to prevent a vote in the Illinois legislature. That's a side play. But some examples of he became a public speaker then. And one of the first ones, I'm going to read a part of it to you, was in 1838. He was only aged 29 at the time. And he spoke at the Young Men's Lyceum.
Lyceum, I think.
Lyceum in Springfield, age 29. And the title of his speech was The Perpetuation of Our Political Institutions. And I want to read that part of that to you, because this really started his career as a speaker and in politics. And he's talking about slavery and abolition. At what point then is the approach of danger to be expected? I answered, if it ever reaches us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of freedmen, we must live through all time or die by suicide. In other words, if we're going to end this country and this experiment, it's going to be by ourselves and not by some outside source. Whenever the vicious portion of our population shall be permitted to gather in bands of hundreds and thousands and burn churches, ravage and rob provision stores, throw printing presses into the rivers, shoot editors, and hang and burn obnoxious persons at pleasure and with impunity, depend on it. This government cannot last. He warned that a tyrant could overtake the country by saying, towering genius disdains a beaten path that seeks regions hitherto unexplored. He seems to scorn to tread the footsteps of predecessors that thirsts and burns for distinction. But it will require the people to be united with each other to successfully frustrate his design. Distinction will be his paramount object, and although he was willingly acquire it by doing good as harm, yet that opportunity being past and nothing left to be done in the way of building up, he would set boldly to the task of pulling it down. And he concluded by saying, we need to cultivate a political religion that emphasizes reverence for the laws and puts reliance on reason, cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason. That was one of the first famous speeches that we believe he gave. He also said about that same time, talking to the young men's mice and also to young lawyers group, and I won't read that whole quote, but one of the things he said to the young lawyers were two things. Never stir up litigation. A worse man can scarcely be found. And he said, if you can't be honest by practicing law, resolve to be honest by practicing and doing something else. He revered the law, he revered honesty. Another mentor of Lincoln's that really wasn't one of the more was in the past, one of the heroes he emulated was, and it can't be overemphasized, was Senator Henry Clay. His old law partner, Billy Herndon, after his death said, Henry Clay was one of his favorite of all the great men of the nation. He all but worshipped his name. He esteemed Clay as a self-made man. He was in awe of Clay's fortitude. And so they got translated to Clay, and at one point, Clay gave him a copy of all his speeches and signed it for him, and the emphasis that he put on Clay and gave to him in his speeches and in his philosophy cannot be understated. He was really swayed by that man. Another person that he admired, especially when he was in Congress, was Zachary Taylor. That came because during the Black Hawk War and because of the Mexican War. And as Lincoln himself said, Taylor was responsible for my political education, also because he was a common man. That was important to Lincoln, to represent and remember the common man. There's somebody else that comes up later that I'll tell you about that he felt the same way about. Lincoln himself said, my mind is like steel. It takes a long time to scratch it in, but it's hard to rub it out. And Sarah Bush Johnson said about his learning, he was silent and attentive. He learned by listening. Good point for all of us. He was diligent for knowledge. Here's what another lawyer said. This lawyer is Henry Drummond. He was a lawyer in Springfield, partner with John Todd Stewart. Lincoln used to come to our office, Stewart's and mine, In Springfield, from New Salem, and to borrow law books. Sometimes he walked, but generally rode. He was the most uncouth-looking man I ever saw. He seemed to have little to say, seemed to feel timid, with a tinge of sadness visible in his countenance. But when he did talk, all of this disappeared. For the time, and he demonstrated that he was both strong and acute. He surprised us more and more at every visit. And that's a lawyer, and some of the lawyers became some of the best lawyers in the state. Another quote from the founder's son, his book, and it's basically in the preface or prelude to the book. And this author, Richard Brookhiser, says, Lincoln was both self-taught and multi-talented. He drew on a variety of models and genres: humor, logic, poetry, fart jokes, Euclid, Byron. He went from mocking the Bible as a youngster to channeling as a prematurely old man. But time and again he came back to the founders, the men who most inspired him. And that's true, and that's the case throughout his entire life. In 1847 he was elected to Congress, and guess what? Congress had a library. The Library of Congress. He spent hours and hours in the Library of Congress, principally because his wife and kids had come with him, but they went back to Springfield. They were unhappy, so they went back to Springfield. So he spent a lot of time there. He also spent a lot of years supporting the Whig Party and Henry Clay. He believed in the separation of powers, executive, legislative, judicial branches. He deferred to Congress when the executive should defer to Congress. And that's one reason he emulated Henry Clay. He had a complete copy of Clay's speeches, as I mentioned. He had this to say: I can express all my views on the slavery question by quotations from Henry Clay. And he recited some of that, and I can read part of that to you also. And this is repeating some of the things that Henry Clay said. And it was about the colonization society. I don't know how many of you were aware of that, but during his presidency, and maybe even started before that, there was a movement, and Lincoln was in support of it in the beginning, to buy the slaves from the South and ship them back to Africa and colony, and pay in reparation, pay the South for both their property. So it was a colonization society, and Henry Clay was one of the big proponents. Here's what he talked about Clay's comments about that. Those who would repress all tendencies to liberty and ultimate emancipation must do more than put down benevolent efforts. They must go back to the era of our liberty and independence, founding fathers. They must blot out the moral lights around us. They must penetrate the human soul and eradicate the light of reason and the love of liberty. Again, to him, very importantly, quoting Henry Clay. Another quote he made from Henry Clay is this, and he didn't talk a lot about slavery even when he was running for president or even afterwards, but he quoted this, he quoted Henry Clay like this: I desire no concealment of my opinions regarding the institution of slavery. I look upon it as a great evil and deeply lament that we have derived it from the parental government and from our ancestors. I wish every slave in the United States was in the country of his ancestors, but they are here. The question is, how can they be best dealt with? if a state of nature existed, we were about to lay the foundations of our society, the colonization society. No man would be more strongly opposed than I to incorporating the institution of slavery into its elements. Again, Lincoln quoting and citing Henry Clay, basically letting us know what his thoughts were about slavery. I haven't talked about Lincoln's legal career, and I've done that in other speeches, and that is a whole other story, and a whole other 2-hour speech. The final part I want to talk about Lincoln's development in education was when he really got serious about politics. After he came back from Congress that one term and got involved in national politics. Basically, the first thing was his run against Stephen Douglas. So this time the Republican Party had formed. He was one of the people that helped found it in 1856, and the Whig Party died. The first Republican convention they had, he was there. Second one, they nominated him as their candidate for senator to run against Stephen Douglas, also from Illinois, who was a rising star and had lots of power and lots of clout, and had been responsible for passing a lot of legislation. This is where Lincoln also cemented his legacy, I think, by a speech that he gave in 1858 called the House Divided Speech. And I'll read part of that to you. And it's about slavery again. Some of his friends said it was a damn fool utterance and cost him the election. I have to talk about the election. Back then, the people didn't elect senators, the legislature picked senators. And whoever controlled the legislature picked the senator. Lincoln won the debates. Lincoln probably won a lot of popular votes, but the Democrats had the most representatives in the Illinois legislature. So when they voted who was going to be the next senator, it was Stephen A. Douglas, not Lincoln. But here's what he talked about that Republican convention. He says the 5th year that the policy was initiated, the avowed subject was putting an end to slavery agitation. But in my opinion, the agitation will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. That's the first memorable speech that he made that got national attention. And it comes right straight from the Bible. Matthew 12:21 and Mark 3, verse 25. As in many of his speeches, including up until the time he was assassinated, came from scriptures. And this is what he said to go on. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Again, quotes from scripture. Some other quotes from people that knew Lincoln. Again, Billy Herndon, his law partner, said this: Lincoln, as a statesman and a political philosopher, announced an internal path about that last speech. Not only as broad as America, but it covers the world. And if you think about it and read it, and look at those words, it's accurate. He went on to have those debates with Douglas, very interesting hours and hours of debates, principally on the topic of slavery. One of the last speeches, not necessarily the last one, but one of the last ones I want to talk about is a speech that he made in 1860. By 1860, he had become noteworthy in Illinois and started to become noteworthy around the country in the new Republican Party. Traveled to Kansas one time, traveled to other states to give speeches, was invited then to come to New York to give a speech. And it got such attention and such notoriety that they had to change it to a bigger venue. That venue was called the Cooper Union Hall. It still stands today in New York City. Well, he gave the Cooper Union speech in 1860. Again, with some references to biblical text. But this is a speech that's known by its conclusion. But here's one of the things he said, and that's the idea of secession and civil war and agitation was really heating up. And here's what he said, trying to talk to the opposition. And these are his quotes. "But you will not abide the election of a Republican president. In that supposed event, you say, you will destroy the Union. And then you say the great crime of having destroyed it would be upon us. That's cool. A high one holds a pistol to my ear and mutters through his teeth, 'Stand and deliver, or I shall kill you, and then you will be the murderer.'" Think about that for a while. It's a great story and a great example. To be sure, what the robber demanded of me, my money, was my own, and I had a clear right to keep it. But it was no more my own than my vote is my own. And the threat of death to me, to extort my money, and the threat of destruction to the Union, to extort my vote, can scarcely be distinguished. He likens it to robbery. And then he concluded, and this is what really made him famous, and some people said this speech, and this is what made him president. "Neither let us be slandered from our duty by false accusations, nor frightened by menaces of destruction to the government or to ourselves. Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith let us, to the end, dare to do our duty as we understand it." That speech, many people say made him president. The author, Richard Brookhiser, in this book, Founder's Son, one of the comments he made was that, and especially after this speech, the Cooper Union speech, and it also goes to the growth and expansion of Abraham Lincoln and how he could use words. "Words alone do not win wars or lead men, but what words could do, Lincoln's would." That's a very profound statement, how he moved people with his words and his communication. An example. Civil War is looming. South Carolina seceded. Lincoln's inaugurated on March 4, 1861. And he says in that inauguration, "One of the more dedicated objects for ordaining and establishing the Constitution was to form a more perfect union. Acts of violence within any state or states against the authority of the United States are insurrectionary or revolutionary according to circumstances. I shall take care, as the Constitution itself expressly enjoins upon me, that the laws of the Union be faithfully executed in all states. Doing this I deem to be only a simple duty on my part. I shall perform it as far as practicable. I trust this will not be regarded as a menace, but only as a declared purpose of the Union, that it will constitutionally defend and maintain itself. The central idea of secession is the essence of anarchy. The majority held and restrained by constitutional checks and limitations, and always changing easily with deliberate changes, is the only sovereign of free people. Whoever rejects this lies to anarchy or to despotism. Rejecting the majority principle, anarchy or despotism and so forth is all that's left. Public servants have little power for mischief. While the people can retain their virtue and vigilance, no administration by any extreme of wickedness or folly can very seriously injure the government in the short space of 4 years. That could have been written last week, 2 years ago. And this is how I concluded Again, this is his first inauguration after some of the states had already seceded. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may be strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and every patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Again, taken directly from scriptures. That's how he began his presidency. As I indicated, he spent hours in the Library of Congress and had many volumes, numerous volumes sent over to the White House. He especially did that after he was president. He tackled the study of military strategy and had books brought to the White House. Also studying geometry, surveying, grammar, and law. Military strategy almost surpassed, not all, but most of his generals. An example of this acumen about military strategy and generals, and again, his humor, making a point. He appointed General Hooker to the command of the armies, but he had not much success with other generals. So he wrote a letter to Hooker because Hooker had said, "Nothing will go right until we have a dictator. The sooner the better." It's the general speaking. Here's what Abraham Lincoln wrote to him. "Only those generals who gain successes can set up dictators. What I now ask of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship." Again, using humor, good language communication to make a point. Not only the founders that Lincoln emulated, the people that wrote the Constitution and the Declaration, but he personally knew 5 presidents. And he served in Congress with John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. He turned to all of those as well as the presidents for advice and information. Abraham Lincoln is the only president who has ever argued a case before the United States Supreme Court. To today. Think about that. Tells you something about his ability. And I have to point out, he never went to college, of course. He never really went to school. But think about this. John Adams and John Quincy Adams went to Harvard. Thomas Jefferson went, and Monroe and Tyler all went to William and Mary. Henry Clay also went to William and Mary. James Madison went to Princeton. President Polk went to the University of North Carolina. President Pierce went to Bowdoin College. And Buchanan went to Dickinson College. Abraham Lincoln did it. About the only president that he emulated that didn't go to college was Andrew Jackson. I told you I'd bring that up later. Because one of the other people that Lincoln most admired, and it surprised me when I learned this, was Andrew Jackson. He had the portrait of Andrew Jackson in his office the whole term of his presidency. Because he admired his determination. He was a self-made man, had quite a history, been congressman and president, been on the Supreme Court, the Tennessee Supreme Court, war hero. So he admired him. And he admired him because he was self-made and earned the name Old Hickory, because he was tough as hardwood and opposed secession. That was the key. He also was a champion of the common man. Other mentors I mentioned before were Orville Browning, who was a lawyer in Springfield, competent all of his life right up to his death, as well as John Todd Stewart. Another quote I'd like to give you is from David Davis. David Davis was a judge, and when I traveled with Lincoln, sometimes they rode together in a circuit caravan of horses and buggies around the circuit. David was a close, confidant, and friend of Lincoln's. In fact, he's the one that made his nomination speech in Chicago in 1860 when they nominated him for president, and sort of led his campaign at that point. And here's what Lincoln said about Lincoln. I think he was comparing Lincoln to John Todd Stewart, because Lincoln and Stewart were partners for a while. And as a sidelight, eventually Abraham Lincoln appointed David Davis to the United States Supreme Court. But he turned him down 2 or 3 times before that. Again, friendship didn't count. He could not be bought, but he eventually appointed him. Here's what David Davis, the judge, said about Lincoln and Stewart. Each estimated aright the abilities of the other. Both were honest men with deep conviction and appreciated their fellow members. One was liberally educated and a lawyer, the other uneducated and engaged in the humble occupation of land surveyor. Stewart saw at once there must be a change of occupation, as the study of law and practice of law were necessary to stimulate Lincoln's ambition and develop his faculties. Every lawyer, indeed every thoughtful and intelligent person, can readily see the influence which the choice of legal profession had on Lincoln's life. And many lawyers commented about he wasn't the greatest lawyer in most cases, but in jury cases he was one of the best. And they said if you also underestimate him, you'll find yourself on the back in a ditch in a legal case when he's dealing with juries. As the author of that Lincoln's Mentors book also says, Lincoln never stopped studying and learning from people and events as much as he learned from books. So his education was twofold at least. He also said this: he made his mark as a politician mostly by communication. He would never have been able to do anything memorable or right if he had not said so many memorable, true words. Also, he was not born to greatness, but earned his way, his map drawn by the men, books, plays, and poetry that he took inspiration from. Another example of his connection to books, and especially to scriptures, comes in his second inaugural address that you've all heard, from Psalm 147 and James 1, verse 27. These words almost came from those passages. As he finished his second inaugural address, he said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and all nations." A couple other quotes. A couple other quotes about Lincoln and his ability. First one comes from Frederick Douglass. If you don't know who Frederick Douglass is, Frederick Douglass was a former slave who became a real advocate for abolition and ending slavery. Became very successful. Was a frequent visitor to the White House. Knew Lincoln well. Here's what he said: "I have found him, as I've already described him, a plain man. His manners were simple, unaffected, unstudied. His language, like himself, was plain, strong, and sinewy, just as appears in his written productions. He spoke as he wrote, without ornament, earnest always, but never extravagant. I never met a man who could state more clearly and forcibly just what he wished to make apparent." That's quite a statement. And also, I was going to read a poem. Herman Melville wrote a poem after his assassination, but I'm not going to read it. But Nathaniel Hawthorne another famous American who Lincoln knew and met. And I'll finish with this. He wrote this in 1862, early on in Lincoln's term in office, his first term. And this is what Nathaniel Hawthorne said, because Lincoln struck him as a country schoolmaster. The president is teachable by events and has now spent a year in a very arduous course of education. No kidding. He has a flexible mind, much capable of expansion, and convertible towards the far loftier studies and activities than those of his early life. And if he came to Washington as a backwoods humorist, he has already transformed himself into a statesman. That was 1862. He still had 3 years to serve as president.
Wow.
That's the education and the mentorship of Abraham Lincoln. Thank you.